Hello, everybody. It's Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Friday, the 9th of July, 2021. A lot of Confederate statues, as you know, have been removed during the last couple of years. So today's topic is I want to look at some of the memorials up north of heroes that were racist. And I'll just leave it up to you to decide whether or not you think those statues should stay. I think they should, but nonetheless, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. This has some PowerPoint, so I'm going to share those with you right now. And here we go. Okay. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, politicians removed 168 Confederate symbols last year. Since America's cultural elites argue for more of the same as a reckoning gesture for America's historical white supremacy, perhaps they will want to ponder symbols to Northern racists during the antebellum and Civil War eras. Consider, for example, the General William T. Sherman statue at the southeast corner of New York Central Park. Even though he was the war's second most famous Union general, Sherman was a hardened racist. After Lincoln authorized Union armies to recruit blacks in 1863, for example, Sherman did not want them. During his May to September campaign to capture Atlanta in 1864, he did not allow blacks to be combat soldiers in his army. In a letter to his younger brother, Ohio Senator John Sherman, he wrote that blacks desert the moment danger threatens. At Shiloh, all of our quote, N-word servants fled, and I won't trust N-words to fight yet, close quote. Before he began his Atlanta campaign, Sherman issued an order forbidding recruitment officers from enlisting blacks. He even warned that any recruiter who did so might be arrested and imprisoned. Despite criticism from superiors, Sherman refused to change his policy. In July 1864, Lincoln reminded him via telegraph that there was a law in effect regarding black recruitment, and that because it was a law, all must follow it. And that was, although he claimed to have the highest regard for the law, Sherman justified his non-compliance by arguing that nearly all white Union soldiers had no faith in black combatants. When employed at all, he believed that blacks should be used as laborers, much like they were accustomed to working as slaves. According to historian Michael Fellman, Sherman even lobbied Lincoln indirectly through General-in-Chief Henry Halleck to discontinue black recruitment. He regarded blacks as, quote, worthless, cowardly, slothful trash. Close quote. He wrote Halleck, I am honest in my belief that it is not fair to our men to count Negroes as equals. In addition to the underlying racism thereby revealed, Sherman's conduct was patently insubordinate. He responded to Lincoln's July 1864 all must follow the law telegram by replying dismissively, when I have taken Atlanta and can sit down in some peace, I will convey by letter a fuller expression of my views. The week after claiming that he was too rushed to obey Lincoln's order, Sherman reaffirmed his defiant opinion to a Massachusetts recruiting agent. He authorized the agent to share the letter, which stated that Sherman opposed black recruitment because, quote, the Negro is in transition and not the equal of the white man right now. I prefer some Negroes as pioneers, meaning road builders, cooks and servants, others gradually to experiment in the art of the soldier with the duties of local garrisons, close quote, but none with his frontline forces. When news of the correspondence spread, Sherman began to feel more pressure from above. He wrote a friend, I never thought my N-word letter would get into the press. I lay low. I like N-words well enough as N-words, but when fools and idiots try to make N-words better than ourselves, Well, I have an opinion. In the ensuing weeks, Sherman remained furious about black recruitment, often referring to the dangers of enlisting N-words and vagabonds. When Atlanta fell, he wrote Halleck, I hope anything I have said or done will not be construed as unfriendly to Mr. Lincoln or War Secretary Stanton. He professed that he never intended his letter to the Massachusetts recruiter to be made public. After capturing Atlanta and progressing on his march to the sea, ending in Savannah, Sherman remained annoyed with blacks. This time, however, his objections were to the fugitives following his army. During the march, an estimated 25,000 blacks of both sexes and all ages joined the various infantry columns at one time or another. Although at least three-fourths of these turned back, either from weariness or homesickness, others managed to tag along. They became a growing encumbrance to the columns as they approached Savannah. Beyond the Ojibwe River, the problem became acute because the land was swampy toward the seaboard. Sherman decided to rid himself one way or another of what might prove to be a military embarrassment in the event of a clash with Confederate infantry, then falsely rumored to be forming on his northern flank. He was determined to do what he could to disencumber his threatened left of these, quote, useless mouths, close quote. As the Corps commander in that sector approached Ebenezer Creek, he instructed the lagging refugee slaves to first let the soldiers construct a pontoon bridge and cross to the far side so that they might defend the blacks against a rebel force he falsely said to be lurking there. Once the soldiers crossed, however, they cut the bridge moorings, thereby abandoning hundreds of ex-slaves on the opposite bank. Many blacks panicked and tried to rush to the soldier shore. Although some succeeded on makeshift rafts, many drowned. The rest were captured by trailing Confederate cavalrymen who returned them to their plantations. Although a subordinate corps commander was responsible, Sherman excused the underlings' action or conduct as a justifiable military decision under the circumstances. The incident only increased criticism of Sherman. After he captured Savannah, he sought to placate his critics by issuing an order that permitted ex-slaves to settle the coastal lands between Florida and Charleston. Although represented by modern historians as a racially enlightened gesture that could have changed the course of Reconstruction, Sherman's true objective was to discourage blacks from following his army into South Carolina. According to Gene Daddle's Reckoning in Race book, Sherman, quote, would soon disavow any intention to convey land title to the freedmen, close quote, meaning that he did not intend for the freedmen to get the legendary 40 acres and a mule as suggested by Sherman apologists. After the Civil War, Sherman took charge of the armies in the Plain States. He promptly put them into service of the transcontinental railroads that wished to have the Indians removed. Dispossession of the Indians, culminating in the late 1880s with the surviving tribes of the West being herded onto reservations, resulted from a corrupt relationship between the government-subsidized railroads and the mostly Republican politicians whose careers they financed and promoted. Sherman's assignment to eradicate the Indians was a disguised form of corporate welfare. In his own words, we are not going to let a few thieving, ragged Indians check and stop the progress of the railroads. I regard the railroad as the most important element now in progress to facilitate the military interest on our frontier. We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, Sherman wrote Commanding General U.S. Grant in 1866, quote, even to the extermination of men, women, and children, close quote. The Sioux must feel the superior power of the government, Sherman vowed to remain in the West until the Indians are all killed or taken to a country where they can be watched. Concerning 19th century railroads, perhaps cancel culture warriors may want to change the Stanford University name, which Republican politician and railroad tycoon Leland Stanford founded. They may also want to consider that the school backtracked on a requirement to provide free tuition to California residents. Under a special 1901 act, the state's legislature gave Stanford a constitutional exemption from property taxes for its 13 square mile campus right in the heart of Silicon Valley. 20 years later, the legislature dropped the tuition-free proviso. But that's another story and a good one. To be sure, the school's correct name is Stanford Junior University because it is named for Leland Stanford's Leland's senior's only son, or an only child too, who died in adolescence. Nonetheless, in addition to being a railroad mogul, the boy's wealthy dad was a Republican California governor and later a U.S. senator from the state. He was also a racist and a vigorous opponent of immigration. Consider Stanford's remarks in his acceptance speech as the Republican Party's 1859 gubernatorial candidate. The cause in which we are engaged is one of the greatest in which anyone can labor. It is the cause of the white man. I am in favor of the free white American citizen. I prefer free white citizens to any other race. I prefer the white man to the Negro as an inhabitant to our country. I believe the greatest good has been derived by having all the country settled by free white men. Those who try to excuse Stanford's anti-Black racism by questioning whether he was speaking sincerely or merely as a politician who had just been nominated should note that the nominee's opinions were expressed impromptu because he added, and I'm quoting, "I have not prepared any speech. I come here tonight without having framed in my own mind what I should say," close quote. Those spontaneous words were spoken by a man who nearly always spoke publicly from a prepared text. Indeed, he was even accused of being a boring speaker because he read his speeches aloud. He lost the 1859 election, but won 2 years later. During his January 10, 1862 gubernatorial inaugural address, he disparaged Chinese Americans. Quote, "The presence of numbers of that degraded people would exercise a deleterious effect upon the superior white race. To my mind, it is clear that the Chinese American settlement among us is to be discouraged by every legitimate means. Large numbers are already here, and unless we do something early to check their immigration, the question concerning which of the two tides of immigration meeting upon the shores of the Pacific, the Euro-American on one hand or the Asian on the other, which of those two tides shall be turned back, will be forced upon our consideration when far more difficult than now of disposal." When translated into plain words, he was saying that it would be hard to get rid of the Chinese if they became a larger share of California's population than they then were. Stanford's chief reason for supporting the Republican Party on the eve of the Civil War was its support for a northern route transcontinental railroad for which his Central Pacific would become a prime beneficiary. The candidate clarified in his 1859 nominating speech, quote, "We are in favor of the Northern Route Transcontinental Railroad. I am in favor of the railroad, and it is the policy of this state to favor that party which is likely to advance their interests," close quote. Even though a northern route would be more expensive than a southern one because it would need to tunnel through the Sierra Nevada mountains, Stanford's choice was motivated by the fact that he lived in Sacramento, not Southern California. Economy of the taxpayer-funded public works spending was secondary to his personal prosperity, even at the cost of many Chinese worker lives. in the blasting and construction accidents to build the railroad and the tunnels. Finally, if Stanford's racism is insufficient reason to justify reevaluating his historical status, students may wish to investigate the corruption and bribery that enabled him and his three partners to benefit their Central and Southern Pacific railroads. According to historian Matthew Josephson, they pocketed $36 million in excess profit from their taxpayer-funded construction company that actually built the Central Pacific. When federal investigators finally asked to look at the accounting books in 1873, one of Leland's partners simply told them that the books were not available because the railroad had been constructed 4 years earlier in 1869. If today's Californians value the lives and dignity of non-Anglo-Saxon American immigrants, as they commonly proclaim, they may wish to scrub Leland Sr.'s name from all memorials in the state. I myself wouldn't do it. But if you really want to promote interracial or a multiracial society, that's not something you want to consider. Let us leave the far west now to consider the antebellum wartime racism among political leaders from the region north and west of the Ohio River, which included Abraham Lincoln. During his 1831-32 American tour, French nobleman Alexis de Tocqueville found racial prejudice to be, quote, stronger in the states where they have abolished slavery than where it still existed, and nowhere stronger than in those states where servitude has never been known, close quote. Among the Midwestern states and territories he visited that never had slavery were Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio, although the same racial prejudices applied to the states and territories of Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota, and ultimately the territories beyond the Missouri River. Consider Lincoln's home state of Illinois. In 1830, when Lincoln was 21 years old, about 2% of the state's population was Black. When he ran for president 30 years later, in 1860, Blacks comprised only 0.5% of Illinois residents. As a territory in 1813, Illinois outlawed incoming free Blacks, and any that did arrive could be punished with 39 lashes every 15 days until they left. Although Illinois abandoned the whipping penalty in 1829, it instead required free Blacks seeking to enter the state to post a $1,000 bond with proof of their freedom. In 1848, Illinois voters approved Black exclusion laws by a 4-to-1 margin. In 1853, the state passed a law that would penalize anyone bringing a free Black into the state with a fine of between $100 and $500 and up to a year in jail. In 1859, Republican Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull, this is just 2 years before the Civil War, opposed equal rights for Blacks. Quote, "We, the Republican Party," he said, "are the white man's party. We are for the free white man." Close quote. 3 years thereafter, during a Senate discussion concerning wartime slave confiscation and relocation, he said, quote, "Illinoisans want nothing to do with the Negro. They ask, what will we do with them? We do not want them set free to come among us," close quote. Other Illinois politicians agreed. When speaking of the lands west of the Missouri River and Texas in 1854, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "The whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of these Western territories. We want them for the homes of free white people." Since the state's wartime governor, Richard Yates, believed that Blacks could never compete effectively with whites in the Northern economy, he considered emancipation as a method to rid the North of Blacks. They would, he erroneously argued, migrate to the South, where their skills suited the region's economy. A month after Trumbull's Senate remarks above, Lincoln's hometown newspaper and a frequent media mouthpiece, Springfield's Illinois State Journal, wrote, quote, "The truth is that the N-word is an unpopular institution in the free states. Even those who are unwilling to rob them of all their rights of humanity do not care to be brought into close contact with them. Now, we confess that we have this in common with 95% of our people against the N-word," close quote. In August 1861, the Republican loyal Chicago Tribune wrote, quote, "The great ally of the slaveholders in this country is the apprehension in the Northern mind that if the slaves were liberated, they would become roaming, vicious vagabonds that would overrun the North, and from the day they were made free, they would cease any kind of work." After Union armies captured plantations along the lower Mississippi River Valley, Lincoln's war secretary authorized commanders to transfer some of the ex-slaves upriver to Illinois. In September 1862, the citizens of Pike County, Illinois, forced such a refugee train to turn back. Chicago's mayor refused to set up a committee to help resettle the slaves. Governor Yates was reported to have said, quote, "The scattering of those black throngs should not be allowed if it can be avoided. The mingling of blacks among us means we shall always have trouble." The attitudes in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Iowa and Wisconsin were similar. Ohio Senator Ben Wade, abolitionist and co-sponsor of the radical Republican 1864 Wade Davis Manifesto, personally loathed blacks. In 1863, during the Civil War, he remarked, quote, "If we are to have no more slave states, then what are we to do with the excess N-words?" Close quote. 12 years earlier, he had described Washington as a, quote, "God-forsaken, N-word-ridden place," close quote. Wade's companion, Republican senator and brother of General William T. Sherman, John Sherman, said that Ohioans were, quote, "opposed to having many Negroes among them," close quote. He added that blacks in general, quote, "were spurned and hated all over the country, North and South," close quote, and spoke of the immutable, quote, "law of God, that whites and blacks will always be separate, or where they are brought together, one will be inferior to the other," close quote. In 1852, he argued that an emancipation bill then under consideration would have triggered black migration northward and, quote, would have made southern Ohio uninhabitable to whites. In 1862, the Cincinnati Enquirer editorialized that wartime confiscation of slaves would cause, quote, "hundreds of thousands, if not millions of slaves to come north and west," close quote, where they would either replace the white laborers or, quote, "have to be supported as paupers and criminals at public expense," close quote. Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, Ohioan Salmon Chase, urged that Union General Benjamin Butler emancipate the slaves in his district after the general had occupied New Orleans. Chase's motivation was not noble. He hoped that Northern blacks would migrate toward the Southern climate. Michigan Republican Senator Jacob Howard opined ex-slaves, quote, "ought to be created as equals before the law," quote, only after he realized that blacks would be contained in the South. Earlier in 1862, he was outraged to learn of a relocation plan for 120,000 refugee blacks to his state. In 1858, Indiana Republican Congressman George Julian admitted, quote, "Our people hate the Negro with a perfect, if not supreme, hatred," close quote. Indiana's 1851 Constitution prohibited blacks from entering or settling in the state. Like other Midwesterners, Julian favored black suffrage in the South because he, like others, believed it would rid the northern states of blacks, where they generally could not vote. Republican Indiana Congressman Albert S. White said, quote, "The Anglo-American will never give his consent to the Negro, can give his consent that the Negro shall be elevated to equality," close quote. Even as Midwestern states were discouraging black settlement, they actively recruited white European immigrants. Wisconsin placed an immigration commissioner in New York City in 1852. Iowa followed suit in 1860. As a result, white immigration to Wisconsin surged from Ireland, Germany, and Norway. But there was never an attempt to entice blacks from the South. When Lincoln's Interior Secretary suggested in December 1863 that refugee blacks be sent to the far West, where he believed, quote, Negro labor was in great demand, close quote, his party turned him down. The Republican Party, Lincoln's Republican Party, turned him down. Instead, on the 4th of July, 1864, the Republicans passed America's first major immigration law, basically targeted at white Europeans. Wisconsin Republican Senator James R. Doolittle proposed that Southern blacks be removed to Florida. He argued that free blacks should be colonized to quote, keep our Anglo-Saxon institutions and Anglo-Saxon blood pure and uncontaminated. This is a Wisconsin senator. Finally, consider racism in the Northeast. Even though New England was the birthplace of abolitionism, the typical resident did not want free blacks as neighbors, notwithstanding his bona fides as an abolitionist. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew turned down a wartime request from General John Dix to relocate 500 escaped slaves from Virginia to Massachusetts. The governor replied to Dix as follows: "For the former slaves to come here for encampment or asylum would be to come as paupers or sufferers into a strange land and climate, and into a busy community where they would be incapable of self-help, a course certain to demoralize themselves and endanger others." In plain language, Andrew was saying the blacks would not do well in Massachusetts, and the state did not want them. According to historian Gene Daddle, Andrew had wrongly expected that Southern emancipation would motivate Northern free blacks to move south, where their, quote, peculiarities of physical constitution were better suited, close quote. A month before the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864, May of 1864, Congress scorned a proposal by Kentucky Senator Garrett Davis to redistribute refugee blacks from the war among the more northern states in proportion to their white populations. That same year, it rejected, that means that the refugee blacks would be going to the most populous states, Pennsylvania, New York, that sort of thing. They didn't want that. The Republicans didn't want that. That same year, Congress rejected an amendment to the Freedmen's Bureau bill, authorizing the Bureau to directly contact Northern governors and mayors to arrange for black settlements in the North. Notwithstanding their impeccable abolitionist credentials, both Massachusetts Republican Senators Charles Sumner and Henry Wilson opposed those initiatives. While I believe the statues to Northern Civil War heroes should remain, I also believe those of Confederate heroes merit the same respect. Americans should continue adding new statues to commemorate the historical contributions of blacks and others who are not presently so recognized. But it should reject the wave of destruction targeted at Confederate memorials as a reckless, impudent, and divisive movement. Given today's cancel culture, vandalizing a Confederate memorial requires no more courage than challenging one's grandmother to a cage match. Our respect should be given to those who oppose the tyranny of a one-sided vindictive zeitgeist. We should oppose the tyranny of those who would challenge their grandmother, essentially, metaphorically speaking, challenge their grandmother to a cage match. Okay, to learn more about how Reconstruction evolved and monuments were treated after the war, get Philip Lee's Southern Reconstruction. It's $22 at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you want a signed copy, an autographed copy from me, $25. I will pay postage if you're here in the United States. Just email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee, L-E-I-G-H @ me.com. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.